My daughter-in-law slapped me across the face. After so many years of serving my family, sacrificing my own needs, paying all the bills, cleaning, cooking, and doing everything for everyone, she struck me because I dared to say I was tired. My husband Jacob and my son Luke watched it happen and said nothing. That moment showed me the truth. After 40 years of marriage and decades of motherhood, I was nothing more than unpaid help in my own home. At 65, I realized I had a choice. I chose freedom, and I made sure they'd never forget what they lost by cutting them out of my inheritance completely. My name is Stella. I'm 65 years old, a wife, mother, and grandmother who spent her entire adult life putting everyone else's needs before her own. For 40 years, I believed that was what love looked like. Endless sacrifice, silent service, and swallowing my own dreams so others could live theirs. I wiped my hands on the kitchen towel and looked around at the dishes still piled in the sink. At 65, my joints ache more than they used to, but the work never seemed to end. The morning had started like every other morning for the past 40 years. I had made breakfast for Jacob, who sat in his favourite chair watching the morning news, and for Luke, who barely looked up from his phone long enough to grunt a thank you. The routine was so ingrained it felt like muscle memory. Wake at 6, start the coffee, check what needs to be prepared for each person's specific preferences. Jacob liked his eggs over easy but not runny, his toast golden brown with butter only on one side. Luke preferred his coffee black and strong, his breakfast simple but ready exactly when he stumbled downstairs. And now there was Ella, whose pregnancy had introduced a whole new level of complexity to my daily choreography of care. The house felt heavy around me, filled with the weight of unspoken expectations. Jacob would finish his coffee and leave his cup on the table, expecting me to clear it away. Luke would drop his plate in the sink and disappear back to his room, where the sounds of video games would echo through the thin walls until well past midnight. This was my life, and I had accepted it without question for so long that questioning it now felt almost foreign. I moved through these morning rituals like a ghost haunting her own existence. Each task was performed automatically, without thought or acknowledgement from those I served. The coffee pot gurgled its familiar tune, the toaster popped with its predictable timing, and I orchestrated it all from my position as the invisible conductor of our household symphony. Sometimes I wondered if they would even notice if I disappeared mid-task, or if they would simply assume their needs would somehow continue to be met by magic. Ella had been living with us for 6 months now, ever since she and Luke had decided to save money by moving back home. Even before the pregnancy, Ella had been difficult to live with. She had opinions about everything I did, from how I folded the laundry to what I cooked for dinner. I told myself it was just an adjustment, that Ella was young and still learning how to be part of a family. But deep down, I felt the sting of constant criticism wearing away at my confidence. The criticism wasn't just about household tasks. It was about everything. The way I dressed was too old-fashioned. The way I spoke was too quiet. The way I arranged furniture was outdated. Ella would make these observations with the casual cruelty of someone who had never learned that words could wound. She seemed to view me as a relic from a bygone era, someone whose opinions and preferences were automatically inferior to her own modern sensibilities. The pregnancy had made everything worse. Ella demanded special meals, complained about smells from the kitchen, and insisted the house be kept at exactly the right temperature. She would call out from the living room for glasses of water, snacks, or pillows, never once getting up to fetch these things herself. I found myself running up and down the stairs dozens of times a day, my knees protesting with each step. Her demands came with an imperious tone that suggested my compliance was not a favour, but an obligation. The temperature was never quite right, too hot when I turned up the heat, too cold when I adjusted the air conditioning. The food I prepared was either too bland or too spicy, too hot or too cold, never meeting the ever-changing requirements of her pregnancy cravings. I began to feel like I was failing a test whose rules kept changing without notice. Nobody else seemed to notice how much I did. Jacob assumed his meals would appear on time, his clothes would be clean and pressed in his closet, and the house would run smoothly without any effort on his part. Luke took it for granted that I would continue to cook and clean for him as if he were still a child, even though he was 28 years old and perfectly capable of taking care of himself. The invisibility of my labour was perhaps the most exhausting part. Meals appeared as if by magic, clothes cleaned themselves, bills paid themselves, Groceries restocked themselves. I had become so efficient at anticipating and meeting their needs that they had forgotten I was the one meeting them. When something went wrong, when we ran out of milk, or when a shirt wasn't pressed, I was immediately blamed for the oversight. But when everything ran smoothly, which was most of the time, my contribution went completely unnoticed. I calculated once how many hours I spent each day on household tasks. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, shopping, bill paying, organising. It added up to more than a full-time job. Yet I received no salary, no vacation days, no sick leave, no recognition, and certainly no gratitude. The work was simply expected, as natural and unremarkable as breathing. Sometimes, late at night when the house was finally quiet, I would sit at the kitchen table and wonder when I had become invisible. I remembered being young once, having dreams and opinions that mattered to people. I had wanted to travel, to learn new things, to have conversations that went beyond grocery lists and household schedules. But somewhere along the way, I had become just the person who made sure everyone else's needs were met. In my younger years, I had been different. I had opinions about books and movies, dreams of seeing Paris, thoughts about politics and art. I had been someone who laughed spontaneously, who had ideas for weekend adventures, who contributed to conversations instead of just listening politely from the sidelines. That woman felt like a character from a book I had read long ago, real once, but now just a distant memory. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been gradual, so subtle that I hadn't noticed it happening. First, I had prioritized Jacob's career over my own ambitions, because that's what wives did in those days. Then Luke's needs had taken precedence, because that's what mothers do. Year by year, choice by choice, I had edited myself down until there was nothing left but the caretaker function. The only bright spot in my week was when Cooper came to visit. My nephew was 35, kind-hearted, and one of the few people who seemed to actually see me as a person rather than just a caretaker. He would help me carry groceries, fix things around the house that Jacob ignored, and most importantly, he would sit with me and really listen when I talked. Cooper was the son of my late sister Margaret, and he had inherited her warmth and empathy. When he visited, he didn't just grunt hello and disappear into his phone. He asked about my day, my thoughts, my feelings. He noticed when I seemed tired or worried. He remembered details from our previous conversations and followed up on things I had mentioned. In his presence, I felt like a real person again, instead of a household appliance. Cooper had started asking me more questions lately about how I was feeling, whether I was getting enough rest, whether anyone else was helping around the house. I would brush off his concerns with a wave of my hand, telling him that this was just how families worked, that I was fine, that I didn't mind the work. But sometimes I caught him looking at me with worry in his eyes, and I wondered what he saw that I couldn't see myself. His questions made me uncomfortable because they forced me to examine things I preferred to keep buried. When he asked if I was happy, I would deflect with comments about duty and family responsibility. When he wondered aloud why I was the only one doing housework, I would make excuses about everyone being busy with their own responsibilities. But his gentle persistence planted seeds of doubt that grew in the quiet moments. When Cooper suggested I should ask for more help from the family or take some time for myself, I would change the subject. I had been taking care of everyone for so long that I didn't know how to stop. The idea of asking Jacob or Luke to help with household chores seemed impossible. They had their own lives, their own concerns. I was the wife, the mother. This was my job, wasn't it? The very thought of asking for help felt selfish and unreasonable. I had been conditioned to believe that a good woman, a good wife and mother, handled everything without complaint. Asking for assistance would be admitting failure, admitting that I couldn't manage what generations of women before me had managed just fine. The guilt that accompanied even the thought of requesting help was overwhelming. But lying in bed at night, listening to Jacob's heavy breathing beside me, I sometimes felt a deep tiredness that went beyond physical exhaustion. It was the tiredness of being taken for granted, of feeling like my own needs didn't matter, of wondering if anyone would notice if I just disappeared one day. I would push these thoughts away, telling myself I was being selfish, that families required sacrifice, that this was just temporary until Ella had the baby and things settled down. The exhaustion was bone deep, spiritual as much as physical. It was the weariness that comes from years of giving without receiving, of caring without being cared for, of existing without truly living. In those dark hours before dawn, I would sometimes imagine what it would feel like to wake up in a place where no one needed anything from me, where I could choose how to spend my day based on my own desires, rather than everyone else's demands. These midnight thoughts scared me because they felt so foreign, so contrary to everything I had been taught about what it meant to be a good woman. But they also felt like the first honest emotions I had allowed myself to experience in years. The longing for something different, something more, grew stronger with each passing night, even as I continued to suppress it each morning when the demands of the household resumed. Still, the tiredness remained, growing a little deeper each day, like a shadow that followed me from room to room as I went about the endless tasks that filled my days. It was a shadow that Cooper could see, even when I couldn't, and it was a shadow that would soon grow too dark to ignore. The morning sickness had passed, but Ella's demands had only grown worse. At 7 months pregnant, she had appointed herself the queen of the household, and I had somehow become her personal servant. Ella would call from wherever she was sitting, her voice carrying through the house with an expectation that I would drop whatever I was doing and come running. The calls came at all hours, for glasses of water, for snacks, for pillows to be adjusted, for the temperature to be changed, for the television channel to be switched when the remote was just within reach. My back aches constantly now. The extra trips up and down the stairs, the bending and lifting, the standing for hours at a time preparing special meals that Ella might or might not actually eat. It all took its toll on my aging body. Some mornings I could barely get out of bed, my joints stiff and protesting like rusted hinges. My knees creak when I climbed the stairs. My shoulders burned from carrying heavy loads of laundry, and my feet throbbed from standing on the hard kitchen tiles for hours at a time. But I would force myself up anyway, swallowing down pain relievers that barely touched the constant ache, because I knew that Ella would be calling for breakfast soon, and Luke would need his coffee prepared exactly right, and Jacob would expect his. Newspaper folded just the way he liked it beside his plate. The criticism had become constant and cruel, like a steady drip of acid that slowly ate away at my confidence. Ella found fault with everything I did. The eggs were too runny or too firm, the house was too dusty or too damp, I walked too loudly or moved too slowly. The water wasn't cold enough, the soup wasn't hot enough, the towels weren't soft enough. Nothing was ever right. When I served dinner, Ella would take a few bites and then push the plate away, announcing that it was too salty or too bland, or just not what she was craving. I would end up making second and third meals, trying desperately to find something that would satisfy my daughter-in-law, while the original meal grew cold and would eventually be thrown away. The waste bothered me almost as much as the criticism. I had grown up during harder times, when every scrap of food mattered, when throwing away a perfectly good meal was unthinkable. But Ella treated food like it was disposable, demanding elaborate meals and then barely touching them. I would stand at the garbage can, scraping untouched food into the trash, feeling like I was throwing away pieces of my own effort and care. The worst part was that Luke and Jacob said nothing. They would sit there while Ella berated me, acting as if they didn't hear the sharp words, or see the way my face would crumple slightly, before I forced it back into a neutral expression. Sometimes Luke would even laugh at Ella's comments, as if my hurt feelings were amusing. Jacob would simply turn up the volume on the television or bury his face deeper in his newspaper, making it clear that he considered this women's business that he wanted no part of. When I tried to talk to Luke about Ella's behaviour, he would brush off my concerns with vague explanations about pregnancy hormones and stress. He would suggest that I should be more understanding, more patient, more accommodating. It was as if he had forgotten that I was a human being with feelings and limitations, as if he saw me only as a resource to be used, rather than a person to be respected. I made excuses for them in my mind, the same excuses I had been making for years. Ella was pregnant and uncomfortable, so of course she was irritable. Luke was just trying to keep the peace with his wife, caught between two women and not knowing how to navigate the situation. Jacob was from a different generation and didn't understand how to handle these modern family dynamics. But the excuses felt thinner each day, worn down by the constant friction of daily mistreatment, and the pain of being dismissed and belittled grew sharper. The financial burden was entirely on my shoulders, a weight that seemed to grow heavier with each passing month. I managed all the household expenses from my small pension and the part-time job I had kept at the local library. The pension barely covered the mortgage and utilities, and my library wages went toward groceries, household supplies, and the countless small expenses that kept a family running. Jacob's disability check went toward his personal expenses and entertainment, his beer, his cigarettes, his magazines, his occasional trips to the hardware store for projects he never finished. He never contributed to groceries, utilities, or household needs, treating his check as personal spending money while expecting me to cover everything else. Luke and Ella paid no rent, bought no groceries, and contributed nothing to the household beyond their presence and their endless demands. They had been saving money to buy their own place, but those savings seemed to go toward Ella's shopping trips and Luke's new gaming equipment, rather than toward building a future. I suspected they had grown comfortable with the arrangement, with having their needs met without any financial responsibility. I would sit at the kitchen table late at night, surrounded by bills and receipts, trying to stretch every dollar like taffy until it covered all the necessary expenses. I had given up small luxuries years ago: new clothes, occasional dinners out, gifts for myself, the subscription to the gardening magazine I used to love. Every penny went toward keeping the household running and everyone else comfortable. I shopped for groceries with a calculator, choosing the cheapest options, clipping coupons, waiting for sales. I wore the same 3 dresses in rotation, patching them when they tore, resoling my shoes when the soles wore thin. I worried constantly about money, about unexpected expenses, about what would happen if I got sick and couldn't work. The anxiety kept me awake at night, my mind churning through scenarios and calculations. What if the furnace broke? What if the car needed major repairs? What if my hours at the library were cut? There was no safety net, no savings account, no backup plan. I was one emergency away from financial disaster, and the weight of that knowledge pressed down on my chest like a stone. The strawberry incident became the symbol of everything wrong in my life, a perfect crystallization of how little my family valued my time, my effort, or my well-being. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Ella was lying on the couch watching television when she suddenly announced that she needed fresh strawberries immediately. Not the frozen ones in the freezer or the strawberry jam in the pantry, but fresh strawberries from Morrison's Market, which was over an hour's walk away through the city. I looked around the living room, taking in the scene with growing disbelief. Jacob was in his chair, perfectly comfortable, reading a magazine about fishing. Luke was on the other end of the couch with his laptop, supposedly working, but actually scrolling through social media. Both of them had cars parked outside. Both of them were perfectly capable of making the 15-minute drive to the market and back. It would have been nothing for either of them, a minor inconvenience at most. But when I suggested that perhaps one of them could go, Ella's face darkened with anger. How could I even suggest such a thing? Ella couldn't drive while pregnant. It wasn't safe. What if something happened to the baby? Luke was busy with important work on his computer. Couldn't I see he was in the middle of something crucial? Jacob had back problems and couldn't handle the walking around the store. Surely I understood that. It was obvious that I should go. After all, I was the one who did all the shopping anyway. I knew where everything was. I had nothing else to do. I felt something crack inside my chest as I looked at their expectant faces. None of them saw anything unreasonable about sending a 65-year-old woman on a 2-hour round-trip walk because they couldn't be bothered to help. They looked at me like I was being difficult, like I was questioning something that was perfectly natural and obvious. I opened my mouth to protest, to explain that my feet hurt, that I was tired, that it wasn't fair. But the words died in my throat. I'd spent so many years avoiding conflict, keeping the peace, being the accommodating one, that I didn't know how to fight back anymore. The muscles for standing up for myself had atrophied from disuse. So I put on my coat and my worn walking shoes, and I made the journey to Morrison's Market. The walk to Morrison's was torture. My feet hurt in my old shoes, which had lost their padding years ago, but which I couldn't afford to replace. My back ached from the uneven sidewalks, and the bag of strawberries felt heavier with each step home, as if it were filled with lead instead of fruit. I found myself crying as I walked, tears of exhaustion and frustration that I quickly wiped away whenever other pedestrians approached. I felt invisible, unimportant, like a ghost haunting my own life. The city bustled around me, full of people with purpose and destination, and I felt disconnected from all of it. I was just an old woman running an errand for someone who didn't appreciate me, walking through a world that barely noticed my existence. Young people rushed past me on the sidewalk, talking on their phones about important things. Cars swept by, their drivers focused on their own destinations. Everyone had somewhere to be, something that mattered, except for me, who was walking an hour each way to buy strawberries that probably wouldn't even be eaten. When I finally returned home, sweating and exhausted, my feet swollen in my shoes, Ella barely looked up when I handed her the strawberries. There was no thank you, no acknowledgement of the effort I had made. Instead of gratitude, Ella complained that I had taken too long, that the strawberries weren't as red as she had hoped, and that she wasn't even sure she wanted them anymore. Maybe she should have asked for blueberries instead. Or maybe she should have just waited until tomorrow when someone else could go to the store. I stood there, holding the bag, feeling the weight of my own foolishness for making such an effort for someone who didn't appreciate it. I thought about the hour of walking, the pain in my feet, the money spent on fruit that might end up in the garbage. I thought about how easily any of the other 3 adults in the house could have handled this simple task, and how readily they had all assumed it was my responsibility. That night, I lay in bed listening to the sounds of my family, each sound a reminder of how alone I felt in my own home. Jacob was snoring beside me, the same rattling sound he had made for 40 years, oblivious to my presence or my feelings. Luke's video games were still echoing through the walls, electronic explosions and gunfire that went on until well past midnight. Ella was in the kitchen, helping herself to late-night snacks that I would have to clean up in the morning. Crumbs on the counter, dishes in the sink, milk left out to spoil. None of them were thinking about me, worrying about me, or grateful for the endless work I did to make their lives comfortable. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel angry. The anger was small at first, just a tiny spark of resentment that I quickly tried to smother with familiar excuses and rationalizations. But it grew stronger as I thought about the strawberries, about the bills I paid alone, about the meals I cooked that were never quite right, about the cleaning and washing and organizing that went unnoticed and unappreciated. The anger felt like a small fire in my chest, warming parts of me that had been cold for so long I had forgotten what warmth felt like. I thought about Cooper's worried questions, about the way he looked at me when he visited, like he was seeing something that concerned him. Maybe he saw something I had been too tired and too beaten down to see myself. Maybe this wasn't normal. Maybe other families didn't work this way. Maybe I deserve better than to be treated like an unpaid servant in my own home, like a person whose only value was in what I could do for others. The anger felt dangerous and unfamiliar, but it also felt like the first real emotion I had allowed myself to experience in years. It was better than the numbness, better than the resignation, better than the hollow feeling of going through the motions of a life that didn't belong to me. As I finally drifted off to sleep, I wondered what would happen if I stopped being so accommodating, so silent, so willing to sacrifice my own needs for everyone else's comfort. I wasn't sure I was brave enough to find out, but the question lingered in my mind like a seed that had finally found the right conditions to grow. Maybe it was time to stop being afraid of conflict. Maybe it was time to remember that I was a person with needs and feelings and rights. Maybe it was time to stop being invisible in my own life. The morning started like any other, with my alarm going off at 6 o'clock, so I could begin the familiar routine of serving my family. But something felt different as I dragged myself out of bed. My body ached more than usual, and there was a heaviness in my chest that felt like a stone pressing against my ribs. I had barely slept, my mind churning with thoughts about strawberries and bills, and the endless cycle of thankless work that filled my days. The anger from the night before still simmered beneath the surface, a low burn that I couldn't quite extinguish with my usual rationalizations and excuses. Downstairs, the kitchen was a mess from Ella's late-night snacking. Crumbs covered the counter in a deliberate pattern of carelessness. Dirty dishes sat in the sink with food crusted onto the plates, and the milk had been left out all night, probably sour by now. An empty ice cream container sat on the table, the spoon still inside it, and sticky fingerprints marked the refrigerator door where Ella had searched for more snacks. I cleaned it up mechanically, my movements automatic after years of practice, but each swipe of the cloth felt heavier than usual. I made coffee, started breakfast, and waited for my family to emerge from their rooms with their usual list of demands and complaints. The familiar sounds of morning began filtering through the house. Jacob's radio came on in the bedroom, tuned to his talk show, where angry men shouted about politics. Luke's shower ran for 20 minutes, using up most of the hot water as always. Ella's voice could be heard through the walls, talking on the phone to someone, complaining about how tired she was, how uncomfortable the pregnancy made her, how no one understood what she was going through. I stood at the stove, stirring scrambled eggs and watching toast brown in the ancient toaster that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. I had asked Jacob to replace it months ago, but he had forgotten or ignored the request, like so many others. Everything in this kitchen was held together with hope and habit, much like my life. Ella appeared first, waddling into the kitchen with her hand pressed to her lower back and a scowl on her face that had become her permanent expression. She moved slowly, dramatically, making sure everyone noticed how difficult each step was for her. She examined the breakfast I had prepared, scrambled eggs, toast and fresh fruit, and immediately began criticizing. The eggs were too dry, the toast was too dark, and why hadn't I remembered that she didn't like oranges anymore? Her pregnancy cravings had changed, and she needed something else entirely. Maybe yogurt with granola, or maybe pancakes, or maybe she wasn't even hungry after all. I stood at the stove, spatula in hand, feeling the familiar surge of defeat wash over me. I had been making breakfast for this family for decades, had memorized everyone's preferences, had tried to anticipate their needs before they even expressed them, but nothing I did was ever right anymore. The goalposts kept moving, the rules kept changing, and I was always left scrambling to catch up to expectations that seemed designed to be impossible to meet. I started to crack new eggs for a second attempt, my hands moving toward the refrigerator out of pure habit, when something inside me finally snapped. It wasn't a dramatic break, not a sudden explosion. It was more like a thread that had been stretched too thin, finally giving way, quietly but completely. The words came out before I could stop them. I told Ella I was tired. Tired of nothing ever being good enough. Tired of doing everything for everyone and getting nothing but complaints in return. My voice was steady, but there was something new in it. Something that hadn't been there before. The kitchen went silent. Ella's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed with anger. Luke and Jacob, who had just entered the room, stopped in the doorway, as if they had walked into an invisible wall. The air in the room felt electric, charged with the tension of something fundamental shifting. Ella's voice was ice-cold when she demanded to know what I had just said to her. The words came out slowly, deliberately, as if she was speaking to someone particularly stupid who needed things explained very carefully. I felt my heart pounding, but the words kept coming. I repeated that I was tired, that I couldn't keep dancing to Ella's tune, that I had been doing this for years, taking care of everyone, and I was done. I couldn't do it anymore. Each word felt like a small liberation, like opening windows in a house that had been sealed shut for too long. Luke stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. He told me to calm down, that I was upsetting Ella, that this wasn't the time for this kind of discussion. He spoke to me the way I might speak to a child having a tantrum, patronizing and dismissive. Jacob cleared his throat and muttered something about women and hormones, as if the entire situation could be explained away by female biology. But I wasn't backing down this time. I turned to Luke and asked him when exactly would be the right time to discuss how I was being treated in my own home. I asked Jacob if he thought it was reasonable for me to be the only one contributing to household expenses while also doing all the work. My voice was getting stronger with each word, fed by years of suppressed frustration. The slap came so fast that I didn't see it coming. Ella's hand connected with my cheek with a sharp crack that echoed through the kitchen. The force of it sent me stumbling backward against the counter, my face burning with pain and shock. For a moment the room spun around me, and I could taste blood where my teeth had cut the inside of my lip. Ella snarled that I was just a maid, demanding to know who I thought I was to talk to her like that. She told me I lived in this house because they let me live here, that I did what needed to be done because that was my job, and I should never forget my place again. Her voice was venomous, filled with a hatred that seemed to have been building for months. I stood frozen, my hand pressed to my stinging cheek, staring at my daughter-in-law in disbelief. In 40 years of marriage, Jacob had never raised a hand to me. Luke, despite all his selfishness, had never been physically aggressive. But this woman, This person I had opened my home to and cared for had just struck me like I was nothing more than a disobedient child. The red mark on my face felt like a brand, marking me as someone who could be hit without consequences. I looked toward Jacob and Luke, waiting for them to say something, to defend me, to acknowledge that what had just happened was wrong. Surely they would step in now. Surely this was too much even for them to ignore. But Jacob was staring at his feet, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to get involved. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, his face red with embarrassment, but he said nothing. Luke was looking back and forth between his wife and me, as if trying to decide which side to take, and his silence spoke volumes about his choice. When he finally spoke, it was to ask me what I had done to upset Ella so much. The betrayal cut deeper than the physical pain. These were the people I had sacrificed everything for, and when I needed them most, they abandoned me. The kitchen felt like a courtroom, where I had been tried and found guilty of the crime of having feelings, of expressing needs, of daring to suggest that I mattered. I was the defendant, the victim, and the only witness to my own mistreatment. Ella continued her tirade, her voice rising with each word. She talked about how ungrateful I was, how I didn't appreciate everything the family did for me, how I was lucky to have a roof over my head, and people who tolerated my presence. She painted a picture of me as a burden, a charity case who should be grateful for any crumbs of kindness thrown my way. I listened to this character assassination, this rewriting of history that made me the villain in my own story. According to Ella, I wasn't a wife and mother who had devoted my life to my family. I was a freeloader who should be grateful for the privilege of serving everyone else. The lies were so audacious, so completely divorced from reality, that I almost laughed. But I didn't laugh. Instead, I walked to the phone with steady steps, though my hands were shaking as I dialed. When the emergency operator answered, I spoke clearly and calmly. I wanted to report a domestic assault. Yes, I was safe for the moment. No, I didn't need medical attention. I just needed someone to come and make a record of what had happened. The effect of the phone call was immediate and electric. Ella's face went white, then red, then white again. She began protesting that it was all a misunderstanding, that she was pregnant and emotional, that I was overreacting. Luke demanded to know what I thought I was doing, calling the police over a family disagreement. Jacob emerged from his corner to tell me I was making a mistake, that this would only make things worse. But I ignored them all. I sat at the kitchen table and waited for the police to arrive, my hand still pressed to my burning cheek. The mark would fade, but something inside me had changed permanently. I felt lighter somehow, as if the act of calling for help had lifted a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying. The police arrived within 20 minutes. Officer Martinez was kind and professional as she took my statement, photographed the red mark on my cheek, and filled out the incident report. She asked gentle questions about the incident, about the family dynamics, about whether this had happened before. I found myself telling this stranger things I had never admitted to myself, about the constant criticism, the financial exploitation, the emotional abuse that had worn me down so gradually I hadn't noticed how far I had fallen. Ella had retreated to her room, claiming she felt faint and needed to rest. From upstairs came the sound of her on the phone, probably calling her mother or friends to tell her version of events, painting herself as the victim of an unreasonable old woman. Luke hovered nearby, looking embarrassed and worried about what the neighbours might think. He kept glancing toward the windows, as if expecting to see faces pressed against the glass. Jacob had disappeared entirely, probably hiding in the garage until the whole situation blew over, as was his way with any kind of conflict. Officer Martinez asked if I wanted to press charges. I thought about it for a long moment, looking around at the kitchen, where I had served thousands of meals, the living room, where I had folded countless loads of laundry, the home where I had poured out my life in service to people who didn't value me. I thought about the legal process, the court dates, the family drama that would ensue. I thought about Ella's pregnancy and the baby who would be born into this dysfunction. I told the officer no, I didn't want to press charges. I just wanted it documented, wanted there to be a record that this happened. Officer Martinez nodded understandingly and gave me her card, telling me to call if anything else happened, if I felt unsafe, if I needed help. The kindness in her voice, the simple acknowledgement that I deserved to be safe and respected, brought tears to my eyes. After the police left, the house fell into an uncomfortable silence. No one knew what to say or do. The normal rhythms of the household had been shattered, and no one knew how to put them back together. Ella remained in her room. Luke sat on the couch, staring at his phone but not really seeing it. Jacob puttered around the garage, probably hoping that if he stayed out of sight long enough, the whole situation would resolve itself. I went upstairs and began pulling suitcases out of the closet. The action felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life rather than living my own. I had never imagined myself as the kind of woman who would leave her family, but I couldn't imagine staying either. The slap had been the final straw, but it was really the culmination of years of smaller indignities, smaller betrayals, smaller moments where I had been told in 1,000 different ways that I didn't matter. My hands moved automatically, folding clothes and packing belongings. Each item I placed in the suitcase felt like a small act of rebellion. My favourite books, the jewellery my mother had given me, the photo albums filled with memories from better times. These things were mine, and I was taking them with me into whatever came next. I packed my medications, my important documents, the small savings I had managed to accumulate in a secret account that no one else knew about. Luke appeared in the doorway, his face a mixture of anger and confusion. He demanded to know what I was doing, where I thought I was going, how I could abandon the family like this. He talked about responsibility and duty and family loyalty, all the words that had kept me trapped for so long. But they sounded hollow now, empty of the power they had once held over me. I continued packing as I explained to Luke that I was leaving. I told him I couldn't live in a house where I was treated like a servant, where my contributions were ignored, where I could be physically assaulted without consequence. I said I had given 40 years of my life to this family, and it was time to give the remaining years to myself. Luke's protestations grew more desperate. He talked about how much they needed me, how the house would fall apart without me, how Ella needed help with the baby. But I noticed he didn't talk about how much he loved me or valued me as a person. Even in his attempts to convince me to stay, he could only focus on what I did for the family, not who I was as an individual. When Cooper arrived that evening for his regular visit, he took one look at my face and understood immediately. I told him what had happened, watching his expression shift from concern to anger to determination. His jaw tightened when I described the slap, and his hands clenched into fists when I told him about Luke and Jacob's non-response. But he didn't waste time on anger. He didn't ask if I was sure about leaving or try to convince me to work things out with the family. Instead, he asked what I needed and how he could help. I made one last call. My lawyer answered on the second ring, and I told him I needed to change my will immediately. Everything I owned would go to Cooper, the only person who had truly seen me, valued me, and cared for my well-being. He deserved to inherit from someone who loved him, not from people who had treated me like a servant. Together, we loaded my belongings into his truck. Cooper had already made some calls and found me a small apartment across town, fully furnished and available immediately. It wasn't much, but it was mine. For the first time in decades, I would have a space that belonged only to me, where I could make decisions without consulting anyone else. I could choose my own furniture, set my own schedule, eat what I wanted when I wanted. As I closed the door behind me, I heard the lock click into place, forever.